Welcome to episode 2 of The Culinary Citizen, a gastronomic guide to international relations. This is Sam Chappell-Sokol.
And Kelsey Marr. Each week we introduce you to a concept or theme connecting food and people around the world. This week we'd like to welcome Alessandra Roversi, a practitioner of the field of culinary diplomacy, who has had some very interesting experiences over the past few months. Hi, Alessandra.
Good evening or good morning.
Welcome to the program, Alessandra. Let's begin with some essentials. In the past couple of weeks, we've discussed a few different facets of the fields of culinary diplomacy and gastrodiplomacy. And today we can go a bit more into depth as we chat with Alessandra. We can take on two very important and valuable components of the field: nation branding on a massive scale, as we've seen at this year's Expo in Milan, and the quote-unquote summit of the field of culinary diplomacy, the Club des Chefs, or Club of Chefs of Heads of State. We've explained a bit about this group of leaders chefs in earlier episodes, and we'll have a chance to go much deeper today. Alessandra is in a unique position, having actually experienced both at their nexus. She accompanied the Chef des Chefs as they visited the Expo this past summer.
Before we dive into all of that, let's share a bit about Alessandra's background. Alessandra is a food, public relations, and communications professional. She graduated from the University of Gastronomic Sciences with a master's in food and communication in 2013. Alessandra is the co-founder of Food Focus, which is a biannual event with films, debates, and tastings around food-related topics. And she's also an active member of the Convivium Lehmann of slow food movement in Switzerland. This year, she has worked with the Club des Chefs and has been involved with the Milan Expo this fall. So, Alessandra, I want to begin with your schooling at the University of Gastronomic Sciences. It's actually a program I've looked into before I decided to go to MIS. And I just would like to know, what was your experience like at the university?
I think it's a wonderful, wonderful program that is unique in its genre because there's basically no department in the school. It basically is a school where the idea of being a gastronome, that's what you become at the end of it, means that you don't just eat at 3-star Michelin restaurant or appreciate small producers and local terroir, but that you actually are able to decipher a little bit the food that you're eating because you're given keys of biology, geography, politics, tastings, travels, and basically it's really a 360 degrees into food. It's a rather horizontal curriculum in the sense that over 9 months in the master degree, we go over so many different topics that it's really hard to delve into details, but it really gives you a broad perspective and the beginning of an understanding of the various fields and how they play together. A lot of the schools nowadays are going into food studies. That's a little bit what it is. But very often it starts within a department. So the geography department would start or the anthropology department. And then they would add a little collection from other classes that were already existing. And it does make sense. But this school was really created only to create a new generation of what the founder, who incidentally is also the founder of the slow food movement, wanted to really create this new generation of gastronomes. And I think that's one of the strengths of this school, is having this very interdisciplinary approach with professors coming from all over the world. And one of the great strengths is the network, professor-wise, but also with students that you get at the end of the school. So I think it's definitely now has challengers. There's some former students have even created classes. You know, in Edinburgh now there is also a master in gastronomy created by a former student. So I think it's really picking up, and a lot of people are interested in the field of gastronomy. It doesn't, and it's interesting because it's not futile and considered not worthwhile of studying anymore. So, but it's a school that is in the sense really unique in its genre.
Now, what do you consider, or what is considered a gastronome, and how do you define yourself as a gastronome, and how have you taken on that role?
And that is really, really a challenge, because when you then try to put that on a business card
Yeah.
or try to find a job, nobody understands, and you spend 25 minutes trying to explain what you are or what you're not, because they think you're a nutritionist, or then they end up talking about anthropology, and people still rely on sort of those main academic established fields. I think it's important.
This is
I
not
always say
any of those,
it's
it's all
about.
of them, almost.
Exactly, and it's really about asking questions and being able to really look at the food system, the complexity of it, and read through the food system, having different tools to pick on for analysis. So you know what a life cycle assessment is. You have a few ideas about the economics of a supermarket chain. So basically, you have a lot of entry points, and you can ask the right questions to look into the food, and each element ingredient that you have in your plate or in front of you, you can actually look into it with through all those lenses. Of course, that's also what you do if you do maybe international relations, which is what I studied first, or some other studies. By no means this is exceptional in a way, but I really think that the idea that food is a topic worthwhile of study, and that it can also be philosophy, it can also be economics, is a bit of a new trend, at least in Europe. It might have been in the US for a while, but for European audience, food has always been cookery, maybe, but then it's sort of only for manual people, definitely not for intellectual thinking. First of all, maybe, and that is maybe only for women and not for men also, so maybe you were studying nutritional science, and then you could help kids get the right carrots for breakfast, for lunch. But so I think, the fact that it's entering the realm of what has been considered more serious science, now we can debate if that was the right classification or not, is really something new and interesting and provocative. So I think this school is at the same time developing a new field of study while already producing quote-unquote graduates that are practitioners and therefore changing the idea in the field. The funny thing is I don't have a business card. I finished in 2013. And I've never been one single day out of work, which means people who need the skills that I've been able to develop know that they need me, but I don't know how to explain that to my parents, nor do I know how to sell it, surprisingly. But the people who need those skills of analysis and project management and communication skills, they know the sort of individuals they're looking for, surprisingly enough.
Good for you. That's awesome.
So what was it like being surrounded with a cohort full of foodies? Do you have any special memories or experiences there?
Oh, a lot, of course. No, what is really interesting is it's set in a city that only has 33,000 people. And I think that's what sets it apart maybe from being at NYU in the middle of New York City, or BU when you're in the middle of Boston. So basically you are in a very small Italian town with a lot of the people who don't speak Italian, which means they tend to mingle together a little bit more than with the locals. But at the same time, you are in Piemonte, which is a very proud food culture. There's the truffle. That's where Ferrero Nutella was born. That's where Italy, the famous brands of supermarkets, was born. So they have a huge, both very craftsmanship and also industrial and innovative culture of food, which means it's a very, very special food place, even in Italy. And then you're surrounded by people who are all extremely passionate. They do their mushroom in the cellar. They produce their own cheese. On the weekends, they go craft brewing. They invite you on the weekend to slaughter a pig. So it really is a very, very special bubble, because in the end, when you then talk to other people, they think you're a little bit in a weird, exactly. You're in a weird place.
That sounds magical.
Because we also travel a lot together. We do 6 weeks of travel, where for 1 week we are immersed in a region We visit producers, schools. We visit small breweries, big cheese making. So it's a very, very also experiential, visceral experience of food, and that definitely sets also the school apart, because it's not only classroom based, books based. It's very, very face to face with the producers, and it definitely sets you in a special mode of visiting, traveling, asking questions, going forward, which I think does create a little bit of a special crowd that then maybe has sometimes a bit of a trouble getting to understand how other people don't look at food with intent. They just look at food as nourishment. So, and it's, of course, like any master students, most of us are in a, we either want to change career, people want to go from ballet dancer to craft brewer, Formula One designer to wine producer. So it's a very interesting crossroad also in people's life, not just studies. I highly recommend it. Actually, there's quite a few people from the US that are attending the school. But in my class, we were 28 people and 17 nationalities. So it's a big, also eye-opener. I can now call people in Vienna, in New Delhi, and ask questions how, gardening is going there, how schools, canteen are working. So it's a wonderful, wonderful networking place.
To whom would you recommend this program?
I think it's good if you've done there is an undergraduate program, but I would say this is merely geared for Italians. I think if you have actually worked a couple of years after your BA and then go, it's perfect because you do have a little bit of experience. I think going fresh from bachelor there, maybe you're missing of an opportunity to also bring some hands-on work-related experience, as it is a very work-related school, very pragmatic. I think if it cannot be perceived only as a, it's not a place to do a PhD and do 300 pages with footnotes, because this is really not the intent. So I think if you're looking into a degree that is challenging but has a very experiential angle to it, it's really the good place. But I would actually recommend working a little bit before going there.
Great.
So moving a little past your schooling, I'm interested to learn a little bit more about what's been going on more recently in your life, in your career, and also in the world of culinary diplomacy. You've been at the cutting edge. So let's start a couple of months back. I know you were on a panel at which you met Gilles Brigard. Now, can you tell me a little bit about how you met Gilles, who Gilles is, and what that panel was about?
So I think it was a very interesting panel. It was in Grenoble in France, where there was a panel on geopolitics, and they wanted to talk about frontiers, borders. And the theme was the new frontiers including in gastronomy and in taste. So they invited myself and Gilles Bragard, who is the founder in 1977 of the Club des Chefs, the club of all the chefs who work for heads of states or royal families across the world. What is interesting is the field of gastrodiplomacy and culinary diplomacy is very little exploited in other languages than in English. I honestly haven't found so far many articles, actually very few, in French or in Italian or in the languages that I can read that are on the topic.
Yeah.
So this basically, I was one of the persons who could speak about this in French, and Gilles, being French and the founder of the club, has an eye on the practice of this, as you mentioned, the practice of day-to-day culinary diplomacy. What was interesting is really that this was done in a school of a master school on an HEC, so High Studies of Economics. basically like an MBA geared school, and it was geopolitics. And they really saw the point of having such a topic in the frame. And you know, the guys before us were talking about Al-Qaeda branches in Mali and their weapons. And the guys after us were talking about the new frontiers of drug trafficking in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe and Western. So it was really a very geopolitical. I mean, there were people from the French army there and us. So it was a very interesting mix where I found it very impertinent and pertinent to have food in the middle of all these discussions, very serious on borders that are critical front lines, right? So, and then basically Gilles presented the club and its work, and he insisted, as a matter of fact, on the work that chefs can do for peace. He quoted some of the dinner that they were doing in Israel with Palestinian and Israeli cooks side by side. So I think it was an interesting way to look into how gastrodiplomacy is a tool, can be a tool when wisely used, of sometimes war and conflict, but also peace. So I think it was a very interesting meeting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's also cool that Grenoble recognized that a conversation about food and about geopolitics of food isn't out of place when you're also talking about Al-Qaeda in Mali and drug trafficking. That can all be the same discussion. It's not. This is not something that's removed because it's too frivolous, which I respect that. That's very interesting.
What I find also, well, on that note, I think in the field of gastrodiplomacy and culinary diplomacy, there is a need now, particularly in Europe, from what I see, to really go beyond the articles and definitions, because now for a year and a half, most of the articles and the conferences that I've seen get really only on the level of let's get to know this field. So now that we've had tons of articles of sort of intro 101, what is gastrodiplomacy, what is culinary diplomacy, and how does it work? And basically, most of the places that I've been giving talks in, or the articles that I've read lately, really are only on this definition phase, which I understand it's a nascent field. But I find now that we're ready to have someone crunching a little bit beyond that. And going into depth into the analysis of either one particular country or one particular topic, because I think we've sort of done and overdone the definition.
That's why we have you here. We talked to Paul last week about definitions. Kelsey and I could do that kind of groundwork, but you're pushing us forward in the weeks and months to come. We're really hoping with this podcast to move the conversation forward beyond just this is gastrodiplomacy, this is culinary diplomacy, this is superficial, and hopefully we'll be continuing to push that forward. And with practitioners like yourself, you are on the ground pushing that forward.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit about? Well, let's get into it. How did Gilles approach you? A little bit of background, by the way, from my side. Gilles Bragard originally started the Chef des Chefs because of his experience selling chef's coats to all the chefs at heads of state. He has probably the number one chef coat, or he did back then, chef coat company in the world, Bragard Uniforms. And that's how he got to know all these high-level chefs. And in 1977, as you said, he started this organization bringing together chefs at heads of state, and they've been meeting annually ever since then. I think they've only taken a year or two off since then. I got to work with Gilles and with the Chef des Chefs back in 2013. They came to the United States for a tour. We visited New York, we visited Amish country in Lancaster, and we visited Washington, D.C., and had a variety of really fascinating meetings. So I'm really curious to hear about how your experiences were with the group of chefs, and what your impression of the Chef des Chefs is, and of Gilles, and of his role in this field. What did you take away from that experience?
So yeah, basically they have this sort of school trip every summer where they go in one of the countries to visit. This year they were in Switzerland and in Italy. Switzerland is an interesting country because it sort of all started with Switzerland in 1977, because back then the chef at the White House was a Swiss. It was Haller, who was a Swiss. who was chef at the White House for about, I think, 25, 30 years, a very long time.
He was there for a long time.
And he was then back in Switzerland, and he, of course, knew some of the French famous chefs at the time, and like Bocuse, etc. So Switzerland was a little bit already in the field at the time. What is actually interesting is to see that now it would be sort of really more difficult to conceive that a Swiss could be the head of the cuisine at the White House, for instance, because of the consciousness we have now in food. What I find interesting to me is the club. It's been there for 30 years, but the attention has been focused on the club only very much in the past couple of years, 3-4 years. I think part of it is they are at the crossroad of two very strong trends. One is celebrity chef. And basically there you have chefs that are not very famous, but they are with famous people. So it's sort of as if the light of the famous people was shining on them. And on the other hand, there is this interest in cuisine and in behind the scenes and politics. So I think they really are more and more famous. What I find interesting is how little journalists, for instance, are interested in the skills or in the jobs of the chefs themselves, but the only thing they want to know is always what their chefs are eating and why and what they're cooking and their favorite dish, which I find amazingly boring. I understand that this would be of interest, but I always found the media were very limited in their search for interest on these people.
The number one question I heard was, "What is your boss's favorite thing to eat?"
Exactly.
And each of the chefs have answered that question so many times, and they get bored of it, or they say, "I can't actually answer that." I forget which.
Because it creates problems.
Because it creates problems. I think one of the chefs, Mark Flanagan from the UK, started just telling folks that the problem is that if the Queen says her favorite dish is, stewed plums or something, then every single place she goes, she's going to get served stewed plums, and then it's no longer going to be her favorite food for very long, because she's just going to get bored of it.
And there is a case, where I think it was Jacques Chirac said he liked the veal head.
Right.
And he basically got veal head for 9 months, and he was like, I can't stand it anymore.
No longer want that.
So that was on the positive side. But anyway, so I think it's interesting because then you also have an old generation of chefs who have been in the club for 20, 30 years. And this year I found super interesting because there were also younger chefs, like one from Estonia, who is about 30 years old. It's a country where most people wouldn't even know where it is or who the president is, so he doesn't get many questions about that. But he's actually at the renaissance of, for instance, Nordic food, because Estonia with Finland and is basically also in the trend. Actually, these days, as we speak, there is a super conference in Estonia called Sauce, which is sort of the new trendy conference to attend, where all the cool chefs are. And I find that with the Club des Chefs, they can, in the next years, with this new generation of chefs also coming from maybe, it's interesting to see that even smaller countries are taking personal chef more seriously, not only catering companies for their president, but that they think it's important that the chef is part of the team, that the chefs actually become ambassadors for the food much more than what they've ever been. I mean, they've always cooked local food for sure, but they've been more and more put in the forefront. In France, Guillaume Gomez, the chef of the Élysée, has had an incredible press. He's all over the media talking about the French chicken, talking a lot about different products. So I think it's really a trend that has been changing, where I don't think anyone had heard or thought about the chef of Putin or Obama a few years ago. I don't, even 5-6 years ago, the press attention was really, really lower. And
it was a byline. It was always, there was a little bit of coverage whenever the chef changed or whenever something controversial happened, but it was always a byline. And now it's mainstream news when there's a state dinner and everybody wants to cover what the menu is. And I just saw a couple of interviews with Chef Chris Comerford about the China state dinner.
The Chinese dinner,
Everybody was really Twitter was blowing up about it, and I think that's cool. There's a lot more interested in that, and there's a lot more people following what's going on in that space.
Well, if that can get people interested into politics, why not?
Right, exactly. And if people care about the meeting between Obama and Xi Jinping and what they discussed because they're interested in the menu, then great. People are tuned in.
But yeah, so definitely it was an interesting experience also to see, because they make an effect because most of the people wouldn't remember their names or know who they are. But it's true that when you have 25, 30 chefs all dressed up in white and they're all together in charge of the palates and of the palaces of the most important places on the planet, it's really fascinating. And I find again that there's really a lot to look into. I'm unfortunately I don't speak languages well enough to, but I think, for instance, the 150 cooks of the Great Wall of China must be a fascinating story to look into and understand how they function. And because there's not one cook, there's 150 of them, and they tour, and each year two new of them come. And I think that's so far away from our sort of personae glorification that we have with some of our chefs, but at the same time it's also so close to a very intricate power that has a lot of, they were showing me all the pictures of the dining room, just the dining rooms. I think they have, I don't know, hundreds. So this to me is really things that unfortunately I don't have the cultural access to, but where to me very fascinating points to delve into. I think unfortunately I'm very stuck to sort of European/Western world cognitive fields in my life, but I really saw that there was in Thailand also the relationship to the king is extremely particular, and I think all of these points are very interesting to look into.
So what was your role with them, Alessandra?
Well, basically, I was accompanying them because in each of the country where they go, I mean, Gilles, of course, speaks French, and in French-speaking Switzerland, that was fine, and English, etc. But it's always interesting to have sort of a guide that shows a little bit around and coordinates the movement. I mean, when you have 40 people moving around, it's always a bit complex. So basically, I was sort of the shepherd, I guess, with Jill, going across Switzerland. We went to visit a local caviar production. There is a warm stream of warm water coming out of the Alps that has been used now to do caviar. So it was a surprising local food, unexpected in the Swiss Alps. But we also, of course, went to see an Alpine cheese production where I think the chef enjoyed very much the pure authenticity of those guys up there in the Alps. And then we visited the United Nations in Geneva, which also gives a broader perspective of where their boss go. And I think it's interesting for them to sometimes be treated as presidents or as chef, when in fact most of the time they're in the back room. So that's also part of what Gilles trying to do, is to give them a bit of the light that they also deserve, when most of the time they are a little bit in the darker maneuvering. So
Just a linguistic note for listeners who might not be familiar. Chef, Club de Chef translates as, and you can translate it better, Alessandro, but club of chefs. I mean, chef both means the cook and the head, the chef.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like, so when Alessandro says that the chefs are treated like chefs, she's saying they're treated like heads of state, not just as chefs. And I completely agree. When we visited Ban Ki-moon, we met Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, on our New York leg. And Gilles and the British chef Mark Flanagan and Chris Comerford, the American chef, they sat up with him at the front, and had a really nice exchange between Gilles and Ban Ki-moon. And I thought that was exactly, it's having them sit in the same place as their bosses usually sit, and them getting to experience what their bosses always experience. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it.
But sometimes I think also their relative power is collectively important, but individually it's anecdotal in a sense, which I find interesting, how they're close to massive historical momentum, but in the end, and that's why I always find interesting that journalists are so interested in what Obama eats for breakfast, because in the end, that is really the small history with a small h, when you could actually try to find more longer term trends of the big history with a big H. And I think the story, to me, one of the stories is really what we were saying, where it's impossible to think that a Swiss now would be the head of a kitchen in Obama's administration, and probably in the next administration as well, because the consciousness of the power of food has completely changed in most of the power places, and that's where I wonder if this change, that definitely is the case in France, in Italy, where they really use chefs as nation branding ambassadors. Is it also the same in Thailand and in China? I honestly wasn't able to figure that out, but I think this is an interesting question. Has this shift also occurred that, and actually, funnily enough, the chef des chefs for Thailand is actually cooking for the king, and he is also in MasterChef Thailand. So he's on a TV show, and he's actually more of a star because he's in the TV show than because he's the cook of the king. What was funny is in Switzerland, some of the Thai fan came to see him. We didn't know, of course, who he was, because I don't watch MasterChef Thailand, but he had fans coming to ask for autographs. And he was more popular in Switzerland than some of the others, just because there's a lot of Thai population in Switzerland, and through Twitter and Facebook, they knew he was there. So, and he's a total star, and relatively then to the others, he's less of a star all of a sudden. But what I find interesting is to try to understand if in his country this shift has also occurred or not.
I think it's interesting also because at least a couple of years ago, the chef for the Thai king was Norbert Kostner, and I think he is maybe German or Austrian, and he was the head chef at the Bangkok Oriental, and that's how he got his role. So it's interesting now that there has been a shift, that the king has hired an actual Thai chef to be his chef, especially that it's coming from the media, and where that divide happens. Sometimes the president invites famous TV personalities. I know Morimoto aided Chef Comerford at the recent Japan State Dinner, and Chef Jose Andres goes in once in a while to work on Cinco de Mayo, and there are different relationships between the heads of state and media and celebrity chefs. So that is interesting that that's been going on in Thailand as well.
And also they had invited the chef for Lebanon, who was also into Top Chef Lebanon or Master Chef Lebanon. One of the two is actually not the cook of the government, because there's no government for 450 days or something. But basically he's also, so there is now, that's why I was saying there is this big meeting between this sort of trend of chefs becoming stars or power figures, and the fact that they now have a club that is taking more and more importance, I think, in the eyes of the public.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think for a while, Gilles just saw this as a fun experience for the chefs to get out and see each other's countries and see how each other lives and serves their head of state. But now he's starting to do a lot more charity events. They did an event in New York a couple of years ago, feeding the homeless of New York. They've done that. They did that charity dinner in Israel with Israeli and Palestinian chefs. I guess what did they do? Did they do any charity events with you?
They've done an interesting event in Italy for Haiti, and actually there was the chef of Haiti as well. So that's also interesting. And he's also coming. Actually, he was living in Miami, I think, before, and back to Haiti. Yeah, and now he's done. So they've done something for Haiti, and in Switzerland they've done something for the Swiss Red Cross for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and therefore there was this chef from Lebanon. So absolutely,
they've done work
more and more playing this role.
Yeah, after the tsunami and crisis in Japan, they raised money by using products specifically from that region of Japan and showing that they're not toxic. So trying to do a little bit of nation branding as well, and supporting products, supporting regions that have been hit by tragedy. So I think it's a much more political role, and that's been only happening in the past few years. And maybe Gilles seeing that as the media gets interested, or as these chefs gain a higher profile, or as all of food takes on a higher profile and becomes more important politically.
I don't know how comfortable these chefs will be or are to be put such in the spotlight, because I think then they need to, again, it's a very touchy field. And we said, the famous example of then the queen would only eat that. But then, if you say, oh, so-and-so doesn't like broccoli, and then you would have all the broccoli producer the day after demonstrating. So I think it's a highly sensitive, and that's where one thing that I've looked into also is that food is definitely a play field for conflict in that sense. There's been this huge fight also at WHO, the World Health Organization, with the Codex Alimentarius, which is sort of the dictionary of what food should be or could be, and how it's sort of defined. They had a huge fight on what Chinese cabbage.
Cabbage, right.
Basically, the Chinese say, that's Chinese cabbage. We call it in French actually chou chinois. And the Koreans say, no, it's Korean cabbage, it's kimchi. So basically, and that has not only a very symbolic impact, but it has a million and maybe billion sometimes dollars economic impact on. So, the chefs will they or are they comfortable playing with, I'm going to promote the black hen of France. Sure, but then what about all the other producers? And then, if they say, rice is the staple of the future, but where is it coming from? How is it raised? And then because you're opening then a Pandora box of complexity, which, back to what I studied, but it means if you look into the political aspect, the economical aspect, the geographic aspect, most of the food we eat are problematic in some way, either for us in terms of health or for the environment, which means they need to have a knowledge that goes way beyond the absolute skills that they have as cooks. But then, are they coached on the life cycle assessment of broccoli produced in Switzerland versus broccoli produced in Spain?
And the cultural sensitivities of where the food comes from, and the conflict background, and like where you're buying chocolate from or coffee from, all of these things, if you're going to endorse one product over another, is any chef coached in that? I don't know.
Exactly, any chef, but all the more they, as
huge loud
then close. I think they probably are uncomfortable sometimes, and I understand taking stands, because it's not an easy, and most people now want to hear only easy, catchy answers, but most of the answer are it's complicated.
But I feel like that's a trend in food now, especially with Dan Barber from Blue Hill. He's really looking at the whole food system and talking about how the products are produced.
Right.
No, absolutely.
He's unique. I mean, he's given himself the time and opportunity to do that. And I think if he stands by a product, it's very easy to follow that endorsement. But a lot of the chefs who are chefs of heads of state, they don't have the time. They don't have and a lot of them are there because of their straight up cooking skills. They're really good at cooking. They might not be world thinkers. They might not be trained in the way that Dan Barber has trained himself. And, he has his own farm. Chef Comerford has her own farm, but not all these chefs are able to have a head of state who cares this much and who give them that platform to learn and to have endorsements based on that. So, that's really an interesting point that you've made, Alessandra.
No, but I think there's been this controversy already now for more than a year and a half or 2 years. I mean, our chefs becoming these sort of new intellectuals. Sure, some of them have the time to go in depth, and I know Dan Barber has been going to a lot of universities and talking to professors and taking the time, which, is interesting. But is that a must, or is that an option for chefs? Do we need to quote unquote judge them on this? And I think it's not every chef has the even the will to go that much into details, because I think really, if you want to do the right thing, and that remains to be defined what it is, it's an extremely complex I've seen life cycle assessments really of tomatoes produced in Geneva, Switzerland, but then it's out of the ground and it's under a tunnel. But if it's solar powered, it's okay. If it's nuclear energy, then it's less okay. But then if it's produced in Spain, maybe it's organic, but then there's an immigrant who does it and has poor working conditions. And then there's the transport. Is it a transport with a truck, or is it a transport with a train? And you see, when you really get into simple, quote-unquote, life cycle assessments, it immediately gets into a complexity of social, environmental, economical questions. And I think, I understand that chefs might not be all comfortable jumping into those debates with anything else but it tastes good or I can make it into a great dish.
Right. Yeah, and we can talk about that at length in the future. I think that international development, conflict resolution, think about the work that Jose Andres is doing in Haiti. Think about TV shows like if Anthony Bourdain is going and inserting himself into conflict situations, and now Michael Voltaggio is doing the same thing. And it's like, at what point are these chefs contributing or relieving these situations? And who do you trust? Like, do I trust Michael Voltaggio to go into Syria? Do I trust Anthony Bourdain because he went to Lebanon and was involved in that in 2006? I think we can think about all these things and talk about all these things a lot more in the future. Let's move on a little bit and talk about your role in Milan and also just learn more about Milan Expo 2015 in general. Can you tell us what is the Milan Expo? What is the theme? What are its purpose? What are its goals?
So basically, it's a world expo, which means there's already been quite a few of them. They happen every 5 years. The last one was in Shanghai, 2010. And the next one will be in Dubai, 2020. Most of the time, nobody remembers the titles because they all have some sort of a title, because they usually involve some sort of life question, energy, food, cities, with some sort of word future, or so basically it's always energy of the future, cities, smart cities for tomorrow. So most of the time people don't remember the title as their sort of general indications of what pavilions that are in there should be, because basically then countries can decide if they want to go to the expo or not. They rent a piece of land in that case, and they build a pavilion, which is basically supposed to represent the country's statement on the topic. Now, most of the time, the topic is there maybe 30-40%, and the rest is a little bit of just sheer architectural fun for the people who do the pavilion, and that's normal. I mean, they can do something that will last 6 months because it's usually 6 months of length. And so it's just a beautiful architectural results. And a lot of the time, it's also whoever paid. So if it's the touristic board, it will be extremely promotional for the tourism. If it's the Chamber of Commerce, it will be very small companies. And basically, there's usually a bit of everything in those pavilions. Now, it's basically individual houses that you visit. Back at the early 20th century, let's say in Paris, when there was the World Exhibition, the idea was really that at the time, no internet, very little time to travel. You had 6 months to go see 150 countries, basically, and it was like traveling, opening your eyes to new technology, innovation. It was really sort of the sharing moment every 5 years where people could learn what the other countries had been up to. I personally question if and how this still has a sense nowadays with the fact that we're constantly connected to the other countries and traveling. And if really those infrastructures bring anything that you couldn't or wouldn't see either through the internet or by going there on your own. Now, per se, it's an effort of building a small world community, a small city for 6 months. It's a huge challenge. You have to imagine this is basically like 150 houses that empty and fill up in 12 hours with 250,000 people in Milan. So you're running a city because there's sewage systems, electricity, everything. And basically people storming in to visit the pavilions as they would visit some sort of a Disney or Expo Park, where you can basically feel, taste, see, touch different elements. So the theme this year was food, energy for the planet, and nourishing the planet for the future. But the question is that, of course, this theme was very appropriate for Italy because of its relationship to food and its culture. But it's, of course, then a lot of people were expecting that the expo would be very different. Now, it's just another expo, which means it is a bit of everything and anything in most of the pavilions. Some pavilions sell necklaces and sandals, and they just have very beautiful landscapes, but no content. So, I mean, it just is what the other expos are. And the other thing is, people thought this would be a huge momentum for activists to question the system, which it is partly, but it's also reflecting the system with its contradictions. So there is a McDonald's and stand that is actually right next to the slow food stand. And a lot of people see that as a huge issue. This is just a small microscopical reflection of who we are and our own contradictions. So it is great that people are questioned by this relationship. And I would hope that they ask themselves how you can have a burger that costs €1.50 or a burger that costs €6.50, and what's the difference not only in the cost but in what the production entails. Again, politically, geographically, socially, economically. So I think it's a really interesting moment to look at these expressions of pavilions. I think now it's too fresh. We're in the middle of it, but it will be also interesting to see how we look at it in a few years, and how we look at how people and countries chose to present themselves and what they chose to talk about. So the US pavilion has a food truck courtyard. Now, how will that look in 15 years? Will food trucks still be in? The Dutch pavilion also has food trucks. So basically, it's really interesting to see how countries perceive themselves nowadays and what they accepted as their image representation around food. But it will also be interesting to look at this with a little bit of more time and see how that is still pertinent in a few years. I find it fascinating to look at old menus of pavilions. You know, I found a lot of old menus from the Swiss pavilions from New York in the 60s, Brussels, the old world exhibitions. And basically the Swiss pavilions were doing French food. They had lobster, they had a lot of the typical French dishes, poularde de Bresse. Bresse is in France, it's not in Switzerland. So it was interesting to see that basically the restaurant of the pavilion were not really that much. I mean, a little bit. There was always cheese, but you know, it's a cheese plate. No DOP, no like product of origin, no specification. And now it's become, not only because food is the theme, but just all the menus are really very strategic economic and political arrangements of how you're trying to position the country, both with expected products. For instance, the Austrian pavilion did not have Sachertorte, the typical Viennese dessert, which I found brilliant. I was like, finally, they're going beyond stereotypes. Well, they actually brought it back on the menu like 2 months after because they couldn't stand it asking. So, you know, when you're trying to go, and that's, I think, one thing that the Swiss pavilion head, the ambassador who's in charge, Nicolas Bidot, has been saying, which I find very, very pertinent. He says, you need to both confirm and surprise. People are expecting you to have cheese and chocolate on the Swiss pavilion. Now, that is, to us as interested in food, extremely boring, because I'm like, why are we always constrained by those two strongholds of Swiss culture, right? Can we not go beyond? But yes, we need it because 9 out of 10 Italians come on the Swiss pavilion and ask, where is the chocolate fountain, which we don't have. But there's an expectation of this sort of stereotypical portrayal. So they want fondue, they want cheese, they want raclette. Now what the Swiss pavilion has been trying to do is to surprise with less expected products. For instance, portraying coffee and then you would say, oh my God, but is there coffee plantations in Switzerland? Maybe in a few years with global warming, but right now, no. Actually, what is interesting is because Switzerland is also a very innovative industrial food country, and that is really part of the story as well. You cannot close your eyes. Switzerland invented powder vegetables with the Maggi cubes at the end of the 19th century. Switzerland invented powdered cacao. Switzerland invented, quote unquote, not directly Switzerland, it was actually a Frenchman, but anyway, it was developed at industrial level, powdered coffee, which was developed in 1938 for Brazil. But the Brazilian had a surplus of coffee production, and they asked Nestle, can you powder that coffee or make it last? So, and that's not yesterday, 1940s, which means it is becoming a sort of innovation is a tradition of Switzerland, also in industrial food. And I think that's an interesting story to tell. But now, of course, people still want to live with the image of Heidi and cheese, and I think we need to maintain it. But we cannot stay for another 100 years with chalet and girls running with goats in the mountain, because that's not only who we are, definitely, thank God.
And that might be the issue with the expo, as you said, is that it only serves, it may only serve to reinforce stereotypes, and it is Disney, and people trample through 150 countries in a day. They want to be reinforced in their own beliefs. They don't necessarily want to be shocked 150 times in a day. They might be surprised what they see in Estonia, or they might be surprised at what they see about Kazakhstan. Oh, apples are from Kazakhstan. That's cool. But they're not. They want chocolate in Switzerland. They want, they want steak and kidney pie.
In the US,
they want a burger and fries.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many Americans who are saying, no, we're so much more than that. And I think maybe all the Italians who are trampling through just want to be reinforced in what they are comfortable about each stereotype.
And 85% of the visitors are from the country. In China, they were Chinese. In Italy, they're Italians. And indeed, people need to have this sort of recognition. And as a matter of fact, if you don't have the basics, it's actually hard to, because as you say, there's so much more to American culture. But I mean, I don't think Italians, quote unquote, public, whoever that is, but they're not ready to go into Cajun food and the Louisiana French heritage in food. They hardly connect the different puzzles of what America is or could be. So I think
they're not ready. They may be ready, but they're not on a 3-minute tour of one of 150 pavilions in a day.
Running
if it were presented around. Right, exactly, running around. They don't care about Pacific Northwest salmon, or like the maple syrup is the heritage of the Northeast. They don't care about those distinguishing things. They want a burger. They want fries. They want Coca-Cola. They want Starbucks.
So, Alessandra, what do you think is the culinary diplomacy significance of the expo?
I think what is interesting is more, in what, again, definitions, but I think I see more as sort of this nation branding, so maybe more as this gastro-diplomacy effort, where I think countries are really projecting themselves through food. And I think the significance is that in a one spot, geographically, and in a one time, 6 months, there really is an opportunity to screen through the essence of what countries in 2015 want to say about themselves and food, because there's not only the expo, which is the physicalities of the building and whatever is being put into that, but there's also all the conferences, the talks, the Twitter, the Facebook, all the things that are around the physicality of the expo, that are all these expressions. There's been hundreds of tweets and little movies and conferences that have had for theme food and France, food and the US. Actually, there was a conference on culinary diplomacy and gastro diplomacy with Jose Andres, organized by the US Pavilion in July. But again, this is for an audience of maybe 50, 60 keen, interested people, not for the public who doesn't want to sit for 2 hours in a conference room where they only have 10 hours to see 100 pavilions, you know? Mm-hmm. So, but I think it's extremely interesting to see also the food that are winning. I was talking to a very interesting person working for a company, and he was telling me, because some of the countries who don't have the money are being put into clusters. So there's the cluster of cereals, the cluster of cacao, the cluster of rice. And he was telling me, see, one thing that nobody talks about in the expo, which is a very vilified food nowadays, is sugar. While there are so many countries that are producing sugar cane, beetroot, etc., and actually he was saying nobody really wants to talk about the sugar because this is the evil food. Salt has managed to find some sort of a balancing message where they say, oh, well, salt is needed for cheese curation and for cured meat, and salt is actually important for your health and your diet because there's iodine, which you need for your body. With balance, not too much, but you need some, etc. Fat is now trendy. Fat was, 10 years ago, you couldn't say you loved fat, right? Now fat is trendy. Everybody, there's books about fat. We all love fat. Sugar is now on the bad guy. And it's really interesting because, again, there's countries like Chile producing mass amount of sugar, but they don't say it at all, nowhere, or they don't want to address even the issues, except behind closed doors, maybe. So I think it's interesting also to see the politics of the food in there. But indeed, if you go one day and you run around, you probably don't have time to read through, the lines because you need a little bit of time and probably people who've been there several times or look at it in depth. And I think it's definitely the very interesting topic for a thesis or something, because if you look even just as, it would be interesting to just screen through all the word production around this expo, all the articles, all the press conferences, because every day there is a bulimia, which I call a bulimia of events in the expo. So if you want content, which most people say there isn't, there actually is, but there is probably too much to the point that you get completely overwhelmed with the amount of elements that you could pick on. But I think, if there's any chance to then take a step back and look into the content production that this expo has given, it would be extremely, I think, interesting for really the sort of pictures, and I think expos are anyway a one-time picture that are interesting to look into, but all the more this one since the theme was food.
Since you're very involved in food and community, what do you think is your universal truth about food?
Well, we all eat food, and basically it's the only thing that we have in common and that becomes us. A lot of my friends always say, well, why are you so adamant about food and not about clothing, where it comes from, or about where your cell phone parts are coming from? But I think food is this, I love the word visceral, because it really becomes us. Like you really are literally ingesting your future self. And I think it really is the unicity of this product, because you can do 360 analysis also about how clothes or cell phones are produced or used, but they're not as common as food is to all of us, in the real common in the sense that it is us. We literally are food. I was actually reading an article in the New York Times today which said, food is killing us because it's the only thing we eat every day and we're all dying. So basically we could do a syllogism saying, basically we are eating food and we're dying, which means food is killing us, right? And it's a funny, of course, it was an irony, but But I think indeed it really is this us in a fundamental way, without even looking into all the cultural anthropological aspect, that it's fundamentally the only thing that become us.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. It's been great talking to you.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to catching up a little bit more with you offline about your role with Club des Chefs. I'm sure we have some
Me too.
back of the house stories to share.
We'll drink over that.
Yeah, sounds good. Next time I'm over in Switzerland or Italy.
When you're surrounded by French people, you need always a glass of wine.
Yes, a glass of wine, and now that I work in cheese, maybe some good Gruyere as well.
Oh, with pleasure. I'll ship some over.
Okay, perfect.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much for hosting this. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Join us next time on The Culinary Citizen as we connect you with food and people around the world.